Hi everyone, this is Marc Bates. This is Rabbit Room Apologetics. So this is part 2 of my 3-part series on the videos I did on the birth of Christ. Now, I want to make sure right up front here for people who have not seen any of these before, I'm not anti-Christmas, right? I love Christmas. I did a video on is Christmas pagan and where the early church fathers came up with the idea of December 25th. It was based on a hermeneutical principle that they used. I think it's a flawed hermeneutical principle. And why do I worry so much about this? Because there are prophecies that point to the birth of Jesus and prophecies that are dependent on the birth of Jesus and that timing that I think is important for us to keep in mind. So with all of that in mind, we're going to the second video I did. And on this one, the title was Christ's Birth on Yom Teruah, the Prophetic Case, right? And this was released on December 5th, so you can go back and find it if you want to. And the hypothesis I present here is that based on facts we're given from the Bible, and a few things that we're going to read into it based on what we do know potentially happened, right? So the first thing is we see this thing where John the Baptist's birth is foretold, right? And this was foretold to Zechariah, who was a priest, right? And the big thing here is that the Bible tells us a fact. It says that he's from the family of Abijah, or from the family group of Abijah, which doesn't make sense unless you know something about why the Levites were broken down into little priestly cohorts. And that was under David so that they could separate the duties out, because you didn't need the entire priestly group to be there every Shabbat. You only needed them there on the big holidays, right? Yom Kippur, on Passover. So David broke up the priests into cohorts, and so they only served a limited amount of time. And the rest of the time, they basically had off to do other things, to do more other priestly duties. So based upon when David broke them up, we know when they served under David. We are assuming here that in the Second Temple period, right, that because they knew when the priests served under David, that they kept the same basic calendar going for the priests. We don't have any hard evidence of this. No one mentioned it, so it's an assumption. But I think it's a valid assumption, because why would they change the order, right? I can't find anyone who's come up with a valid reason why the order would be changed. So we'll just base it on, hey, common sense, right? We're reestablishing, Nehemiah and Ezra are reestablishing the service at the temple. They built the second temple. Why wouldn't they break it up the way David did? Okay? So we know when Zacharias served. We know that he received during his service, and it wasn't like a Passover service, so it wasn't like the entire priestly clan was there, right? He received a prophecy of the birth of his son, who was going to be named John, right? And he was struck mute, right? Because he didn't believe it. So Zechariah comes back. Elizabeth becomes pregnant shortly after the end of his service. So there's a child, and we know that this child is going to be John. We're going to assume that John has a very normal child gestation period, right? And is born approximately 9 months later, or a little bit less, 80-some weeks, right? Whatever it is. First births can sometimes, especially from an older couple, can sometimes happen a little bit quicker. But yeah, who cares, right? We're saying basically approximately 8.5, 9 months, right? John gets born. In the 6th month of her pregnancy, Mary visits Elizabeth, right, after having conceived, right, Jesus in her womb. And Elizabeth says, John jumped. My baby jumped for joy. You're pregnant. And Mary said, yes, I am. Okay. So we now know that Jesus was about 6 months behind John the Baptist. We know when Zacharias served, so we know approximately when John the Baptist would have been born. And 6 months later, Jesus would have been born. That gives us a great timeline. And based upon that kind of information, we're going to assume once again about 3 BC in September-ish time frame for Jesus' birth, around what would be the festival Yom Teruah, or the Feast of Trumpets, right? And the reason this is so important is Yom Teruah has been seen consistently in biblical texts. Once again, you're not going to see these per se in these 66 books of the Protestant Bible that you would consider scripture, but this would be in the apocryphal books and the Pseudepigrapha, which are books that were normally published with the other books, but are not considered canon scripture, right? But they're good texts to tell us how people were thinking and what other items they were working on. And so we know from that Yom Teruah, Feast of Trumpets, which in the trumpets were always used to herald the coming king, right? That this was seen as a sign of the coming Messiah, that he probably should be born on Yom Teruah because that's when he's coming in. Now, the other thing, of course, the Yom Teruah is part of the fall festival season, and what happens right after Yom Teruah is Yom Kippur, where all the sins of Israel are forgiven them. So it's forgiveness of sins tie-in. And then what happens right after that is the festival of booths, Sukkot, right? And that's where the king, prophetically, right, would dwell with his people. And John, in his gospel, tells us that Christ tabernacled with his people, right? And that's exactly the wording used in some of these Jewish texts about the king. When he would return, the king would tabernacle with them, dwell with them, right? And that's what the Feast of Booths was all about. So we have some prophetic tie-ins saying that Christ would be born in this specific time frame, right? The fall festivals. And that's the proof text that I was using here. Very few people had any negative comments on this particular video. I don't think, unless you knew Yom Teruah was the Feast of Trumpets, you may not have even seen a tie in there that you wanted to comment on. So that one went relatively cleanly. So, but we're now building up a preponderance of evidence. We have the Revelation 12, which John wrote, right? And it was not a prophecy; it was a proof text of the birth of Jesus. And once again, these stars are not astrological signs. You're not telling your future with them. They were signs put up there by God to tell the story he wants us to know. And what you look at is not these weird pictures supposedly that are up there, because they're not there, but it's the naming of the stars that make up the constellations, right? And these 12 constellations are important for timekeeping because they are the constellations that pretty much everyone in that area of the ancient Near East would see appearing at the same basic time of year, month after month after month, year after year after year. And so you can build your storytelling around these stars, because you see them, and without all the city lights like we have today in modern times, the stars are very clear, very easy to see. So keep that in mind. So the next one, we're going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that's the one that got a lot of attention, and we'll talk about that one next. So thank you very much. Please think about liking and subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so. Share this with a friend who may be thinking about these questions, and look into the description. I have 2 links, one to my Bible study, which I've got a big special event happening shortly, or not event, but a special offer for everyone happening. I'll be announcing in January, and then the link to get a discount on Logos Bible Study software, which is the Bible study I've been using for 25 years, basically. And it's a good little discount. If you're not using a Bible study software package and you want the best and you want it at a discount, use the link. Okay, everyone, thank you very much. Have a great day.